Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations World Food Program, commonly called WFP? What is the World Food Program doing to provide assistance to literally tens of millions of people who have had their lives disrupted because of perhaps natural disasters or civil wars? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at a United Nations agency, the World Food Program, and what it's doing to assist literally tens of millions of people around the world. My guest today is an expert on the World Food Program. My guest today is Mr. Gerry Bourke. Gerry Bourke, an Irish national, is the Senior Communications Officer for the United Nations World Food Program. Gerry Bourke, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's jump right into it. What is the World Food Program? When was it started? Why was it started? What is your mission?
The World Food Program is the largest humanitarian agency in the world fighting hunger around the world. Typically, we support around about 80 million people in 80 countries. The poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. We have been in existence since 1963. We started out as essentially a provider of bulk food, surplus food, if you like, provided by the United States, among others, and channeling that to hungry people around the world. We've moved along quite considerably since then. We have a very diverse range of tools to address hunger. But as I say, basically the biggest agency in the world of its kind.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've seen a lot of disasters take place around the world, natural disasters, civil wars, what have you. Your sister UN agencies like the UN High Commission for Refugees, their caseload really went from like 10 million to over 50 million this year, 10 million from about 6, 8, 10 years ago to 50 million people. Have you seen yours go up quite dramatically because of the disasters that have happened around the world? Are you helping more people today?
Well, basically, as I say, of the 80 million people that we support, that's only 1/10 of the 800 million people around the world who are chronically malnourished. So day in, day out, don't get enough food. We have to focus. We focused on the biggest emergencies. Emergencies, as you say, are a major part of what we do. Wars, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Ukraine, Central African Republic, Mali, South Sudan. A lot of focus on those places at the moment. Natural disasters is another big one. The impacts of climate change, a huge worry. So a lot of our attention is taken by the immediate, by the need to respond urgently. We are also what we call a dual mandate agency. We also have a developmental function. But when we are so focused, so consumed by the urgent and the immediate, we can't always pay sufficient attention to attacking the underlying causes, which is a tragedy.
Exactly. And of course, we who live in developed countries, and many people in developing countries too, do not have to worry about food security. They're in good shape and they have enough food for them, but we find people who are in very dire straits. Now, you brought some items with you today to help dramatize how little it takes. I mean, I'm not minimizing it, but I'm just talking about as far as providing assistance to people that can keep people alive for days and days and weeks and weeks. What are these items that you brought with you?
So these are high energy biscuits. They're fortified with vitamins and minerals, and typically when people are on the move, refugees, IDPs, they haven't got access to cooking facilities. These are a very basic product that keep hunger at bay. These two items here, they are basically, again, fortified foods, easy to consume. They're for young children, and they stave off acute malnutrition. This is a voucher, essentially a credit card, and we are using that in places like Jordan and Lebanon. It's Syrian refugees, victims of Syria's civil war, who have moved to neighboring countries, and they can use this as a credit card. They can go into a shop with which the World Food Programme has a partnership or an arrangement, and they can choose which foods that they want to consume. They get a monthly allowance per person, and it's a very effective way of providing food assistance, and it's very dignifying for its recipients.
Exactly. And so you're moving to more of this credit card voucher type of program as opposed to actually physically delivering huge bulk of food, like a sack of flour or something like that.
Correct. I mean, in 2014, for example, last year, we were providing cash and vouchers in around about 80 countries. So it's an increasingly more sizable proportion of the work that we do.
Now, if our viewers would like more information, they can go to www.wfp.org and learn much more about the World Food Program. They can also decide how they can make donations to help the World Food Program, because I'm sure with this burgeoning really disaster that is taking place in many areas of the world, you need more money to provide assistance to these folks. You mentioned Syria a minute ago. Let's focus on that for a minute. That is just a, I'm not even going to say a slow motion car wreck. It has turned into a very fast break type of disaster. What are some of the challenges that you're running into in helping to provide assistance to the Syrians? As you mentioned, IDPs, internally displaced persons, as well as perhaps people outside of Syria.
Yeah, it's by far the largest crisis that we are seeking to deal with at the moment. We are feeding 4 million people inside Syria. We are supporting about 1.2 million refugees in the 5 neighboring countries: Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq. But it's a really tough place, Syria, inside of Syria. As I say, 4 million people. That's a lot of people to feed. It's a lot of food to move. It's a lot of negotiating to be able to move the food from the warehouse, perhaps across battle lines, to people urgently in need. Our people on the ground, they're little short of heroes, the folk who have to negotiate that access. You may spend much of the day, for example, talking to the government to move a convoy of food out of Damascus, and then we may spend much of the night negotiating with different rebel factions, not all of whom will see it to be in their interest to allow the food to move down those roads. So it can take days, it can take weeks, it can take months. And if the battle lines shift, then we may have to start all over again. So it's a really tough undertaking, but it's very vital, very valuable.
And this is something that's totally alien to most of us. We just can't envision that, where you have to negotiate with the government, you have to negotiate with warring parties, you have to deal with all these problems, logistical problems. This is also very dangerous for your people, and not just the World Food Program, but there are many United Nations agencies, UNICEF, UN Children's Fund, 125,000 peacekeepers. A lot of the UN people are in harm's way. How severe of a problem is this for you and the World Food Program?
It's very risky, but it's very risky not just for us, but for our cooperating partners on the ground. And a lot of those are local NGOs, civil society organizations. For example, the Syrian Arab Red Crescent inside of Syria has lost more than 30 of its staff since the start of the war, supporting organizations like WFP. So in short, very risky. They're very brave people. As I said, they're heroic people. But it's a very necessary job that has to be done.
Mm-hmm. And who are some, you mentioned the Red Crescent, who are some of your other partners, both UN agencies as well as non-governmental organizations, faith-based groups, groups like that?
Well, we work very closely. We've just been talking about Syria. We work very closely, for example, with the Refugee Agency, UNHCR. We work very closely with UNICEF. We work with the World Health Organization, for example, in West Africa during the Ebola crisis. And we work with more than 1,000 non-governmental organizations. They do huge work at the coalface where the rubber hits the road. They're absolutely vital. We couldn't function without them.
Exactly. What is the role of the private sector? I know it seems like years ago I read about where you had some corporate support. I think Yum's Foods was a corporate sponsor of a lot of, or donating money and that type of thing, or food, or whatever the case might be, the World Food Program. But do you have corporations, the private sector folks who are involved in helping you to achieve your goals?
Absolutely, yes. We have many of them. We're building that base. It's becoming increasingly important, both as a source of funding, which is important, but also as a source of expertise. Basically, the private sector has so much to offer in so many dimensions of what we do. You may be aware that next year the Secretary General is organizing the so-called World Humanitarian Summit, the very first World Humanitarian Summit. It's looking at the current humanitarian landscape, how that is likely to evolve over the next 15 or 20 years, what challenges will be thrown up as a result, and what kind of responses are needed. And one of the conclusions of the many folk who have been involved in preparing for this summit is that the private sector has to be front and central in terms of response and support.
Now, with this humanitarian summit, will this be a multi-agency summit? This will involve a large number of the United Nations agencies. It'll bring in non-governmental organizations. You mentioned the private sector, corporations will be there. So it will be really a major summit to involve all the players and stakeholders to try to come to develop a strategy, I guess, to deal with the myriad of problems, not just hunger or whatever the case might be, but other problems. Is that indeed the case?
Indeed it is. In fact, the preparations have been underway for more than a year. There have been several what they call regional consultations, so relevant stakeholders in the Middle East, in parts of Asia, in parts of Africa, in parts of Latin America, getting together, discussing what are their sort of common problems, what sort of shared vision do they have in terms of solving those problems, and then all that is sort of being aggregated. There will be a report, I think, coming out early next year in the name of the Secretary General, basically making a series of recommendations based on these consultations, and those will be discussed by heads of state and government who congregate in Istanbul in Turkey for the summit in May of next year.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website, www.globalconnectionstelevision.com, to see this show and previous programs. Also, please, if you would like, send us suggestions, recommendations for future topics and future guests. Today, we're looking at the United Nations World Food Program, commonly called WFP, and my guest today is an expert on the UN World Food Program. My guest today is Mr. Gerry Bourke, an Irish national who is the Senior Communications Officer for the United Nations World Food Program. Gerry, we're talking about the UN World Food Program and some of the challenges that you have. Financing is obviously a challenge. It has to be. Funding is always one. Another is that you're in harm's way. Many of your people are in harm's way. You have to negotiate with a wide range of characters and players to move the food to people. As you look at it, though, what are some of the other challenges that you run into that we haven't talked about up to this point?
Yeah, let me just go back a little bit to the funding challenge. Mm-hmm. The cost of our operations this year, the cost of the work that we have to do around the world, is around about $7.5 billion US. We had the same bill last year. And last year, in terms of resource mobilization, in terms of funding, was a good year. We managed to mobilize about 2/3 of what we need. So we are constantly underfunded. So we have to make choices as to what programs to cut, what people to remove from the books, how much rations need to be reduced. So these are tough. These are tough issues, tough choices, and they're really choices that shouldn't have to be made. There's more than enough food in the world to go around. In fact, there's huge waste. But it's a question of moving the food from surplus areas to deficit areas and all kinds of other challenges. Another big challenge is access. Access is a big challenge, obviously, in a war zone. We talked about Syria. big access problems in Yemen. So a lot of the people in a war zone who are very needy, very deserving of support from WFP and others can't get it because we can't reach them for security reasons. So those are two really big challenges. But there are plenty more.
Exactly, yes. And some of the international aid experts recently have been opining, and I think they have documentation to prove this, but they're saying because of the funding is not sufficient for agencies such as yours, the World Food Program, or other groups that are providing assistance to people such as internally displaced persons in Syria or wherever it might be, Libya or whatever the case might be, that a lot of these people, these refugees, are leaving. They're saying, I'm going to die here, but I may as well try to get to Europe, or I may as well try to get to wherever, across the Mediterranean in a leaky boat or whatever the case might be, because either way I may die, but at least I have a chance. Would it not help if we could get more money were supplied to the World Food Program or the UN Children's Fund or whatever to help the people in their localities so that they have a minimal standard of living to keep them alive, and with the hopes that someday they can go back in? Would that not be perhaps a better approach than having them move or change residence just by their feet and move to another area?
Sure. I mean, fundamentally, we believe that folk in need of humanitarian assistance, deserving of humanitarian assistance, should be supported wherever they are. As we mentioned, lots of folk have voted with their feet, left Syria, gone to neighboring countries. Some have now gone to Europe. But absolutely, and one of the reasons there has been this migration to Europe is that agencies like the World Food Program have not been sufficiently supported to maintain their programs in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Turkey, etc. And hence you see these tragic migrations oftentimes to Europe of these refugees. So very important that our programs be supported more. And that, I think, is going to be a big focus. It's already a focus in the lead up to the World Humanitarian Summit, that you have donors are being consistently generous, but the needs continue to outpace the resources available. So we need to look at new ways, innovative ways of raising the money and ensuring that programs can be implemented at the level that they are programmed.
Now, this past September, the 193 members of the United Nations General Assembly came together in New York basically at the opening session of the UN General Assembly and adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and these are going to be the development. This is going to be the development agenda for the next 30 years, or 15 years, I'm sorry, until 2030. These are building on the Millennium Development Goals, and of course, the idea is to eliminate poverty, to promote universal primary school education, to deal with climate change, to promote sustainable development, that type of thing. All 17 of these goals are very important to you, I'm sure, in your operation, but are there one or two that come to the surface that you're dealing with perhaps a little more emphatically in your operations and in your planning and implementation and delivery?
As you say, they're all very important, and we must all work very hard towards the attainment of all 17 of them. As the World Food Programme, we're particularly interested, of course, in SDG 2, the elimination of hunger in the next 15 years. That's a huge opportunity. It's a huge challenge. The endorsement of that goal, of the 17 goals, a huge achievement. But in the period of the Millennium Development Goals, so essentially the last 15 years, the world came together and managed to lift 200 million people around the world out of hunger. Since there are 4 times that number, 800 million people around the world chronically malnourished, we're going to have to quadruple that achievement. That's a big ask, and it's going to require all kinds of people coming together and working very hard. It's going to require very strong commitment from government. It's going to require huge investments in agriculture, in social protection systems. We're going to have to do an awful lot more to empower women who are vital in this respect. We have to involve young people. We were talking about the private sector. We have to involve much more actively the private sector. We need all kinds of innovation. So it's a huge enterprise. It's all hands to the pump. But we are very hopeful that we can eradicate this in 15 years.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And what role, it seems like it doesn't matter the discussion we're having, climate change comes into it, because it is becoming more and more obvious that climate change is taking place. The scientific data are there. We see just dramatic changes in virtually every country of the world almost. How is this playing into it, and how is it affecting what you're doing as far as to help provide food assistance to people in Syria or Yemen or wherever it might be?
It's a big challenge, and it's becoming even more so. So many of the places where we work are affected by the impacts of climate change. Of course, you have adverse weather. You have heavier than normal rainfall that can impact crops. You can have drought that, of course, can impact food production levels. Tensions between communities can be aggravated in a drought situation. Competition over land resources. Some experts have predicted that by 2050, the incidence of child malnutrition will be up by 20% because of climate change. So lots of challenges in all kinds of respects, and therefore lots of work to do. So very hopeful that the Climate Change Summit in Paris in December will make some of the tough decisions needed and will have a positive impact on the sort of food insecurity that we're concerned about.
And it's interesting to note too that this whole situation in Syria, one of the major driving forces, one of the major factors in creating this instability was due to climate change, because many of the people in the agricultural area, because of a drought, were driven into the cities. They also, because of diversion of a river, as I understand it, a water supply for them, and of course that put them in a situation where there was a lot of tension that led, I'm not saying it was completely climate change, but it certainly contributed to this overall unstable situation in Syria. Now, with any agency, people ask you, I'm sure, as I recall, the World Food Program has one of the highest returns as far as if I donated $1 or a yen or whatever, or a euro to you, what percentage of that goes into the actual distribution or to food and to help people as opposed to administrative overhead?
Well, 93 cents in the dollar goes directly to the field. Our overhead is basically 7% of a contribution. So that's pretty low by any standard, and we're proud of that.
It certainly is. It's very low, yes. It certainly is. How do you have a very diverse, you have a very specific mission, but still you deal with so many diverse elements out there. How do you gauge the effectiveness of your programs? Do you look at it as to the number of tons of food delivered, or can you identify how many people perhaps you've kept alive, people who would have died without your assistance? It seems like it'd be very difficult to get a tangible measurement, a quantifiable measurement on how you measure success, or effectiveness, I should say.
Well, I think one of the key measures of effectiveness, and essentially our goal is to make ourselves redundant. And a big part of what we do is to seek to build the capacity of national governments, local communities, so that they can build and maintain the food systems and the infrastructure necessary to ensure that everybody in that community is adequately nourished. So huge amount of capacity building on all kinds of fronts: disaster risk reduction, nutrition, and we have transitioned out of about 24 countries over the last 25 years. So that's a pretty significant indicator of success, we think, and we hope to be able to build on that in the coming years, and we certainly will if the zero hunger goal is attained.
And it certainly can be. In the last minute or so that we have left, though, as you mentioned, we're going to have even more challenges in the future. If we do, by 2050, have over 10 billion people, we have 7.3 billion now, how much more of a challenge will that be for us?
It will be a challenge. We talked about climate change, we talked about the drift into the cities. One of the impacts of climate change is that there is increased urbanization as a result. I think the statistic is that something like 2/3 of the world's population will be living in cities by 2050. That compares to around about half now. And that will be in poorer countries. So that will throw up all kinds of challenges that need to be addressed. The landscape is always moving. Yes, we have success here, but we have an additional challenge there. And the challenges are building. Intrastate conflict, urbanization, climate change, El Nino at present. So we can never rest easy, we can never rest on our laurels. We have a lot of work to do.
You certainly do. And Gerry Bourke with the United Nations World Food Program, as I mentioned earlier, our viewers can go to wfp.org and get more information about your program, what you're doing, and also if they would like, they could determine how they could contribute, which is a 501c3 contribution, tax deductible. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.